I first gave a talk about Beethoven's 9th Symphony in May 2016 as part of the Stockton Symphony's Insights lecture series. This was ahead of its performance by the Stockton Symphony at that season's finale. On that occasion, due to time constraints, I had to overlook large sections of the work, especially in the first three movements. I rectified this problem in a prior podcast posted as Part 1, dealing with movements 1 through 3. The work is simply too large to tackle in one talk. The fourth movement is vast enough to merit its own lecture. In this podcast, Part 2, we will examine this famous choral movement in some detail. For historical background and genesis of the symphony, I recommend that you go back and listen to Part 1. It is on YouTube and on my website, morissenegor.com. That's with one R, morissenegor.com. My website also has a detailed 20-page handout on Beethoven's Ninth that is a good reference for those who wish to delve deeper. Any concert featuring Beethoven's Ninth is not just a performance, it's an event. It is a great spectacle with an orchestra, huge chorus, and 4 soloists on stage, and a symphony with a running time of around 80 to 90 minutes. In the first 3 movements, the audience listens to and observes just the orchestra. In the fourth, the spectacle truly comes alive. The fourth movement is a cantata. A cantata is a sacred or secular musical work, generally for chorus and orchestra. Note that cantata is not quite the same as oratorio, also a musical work for chorus and orchestra. An oratorio is an opera without a stage and costumes. A cantata is not an opera. Beethoven conceived his revolutionary fourth movement as a freestanding cantata with an instrumental overture and 4 choral acts. These various sections of the movement are clearly demarcated with pauses between each. Beethoven had a good deal of trouble with the problem of linking this movement, one with human voices, to the earlier instrumental movements. Remember that this was the first time ever when the human voice appeared in a symphony. Until then, the symphony was always an instrumental work since its early origins in the 1500s. You can find more detail on the evolution of the symphony as a genre in Part 1 of my podcast. Beethoven resolved the problem of linking the instrumental parts of the symphony to the choral with an overture that initiates the cantata. The overture. The overture is entirely instrumental and is in 2 parts. In the first, music from prior movements is recalled. In the second, the Ode to Joy is announced. Overture Part 1 features a retrospective review of prior movements along with an instrumental recitative by a hero speaker. A recitative is a musical declamation that occurs in the narrative and dialogue parts of opera and choral works. It is sung in the rhythm of ordinary speech. In the overture recitative, the hero speaker is in the low strings, a male instrumental voice, and he presages the baritone who will enunciate a corresponding part later in Act 1. The music of the prior movements is rejected, and a new music, the Ode to Joy, is presented. The overture begins with a sudden, loud, turbulent fanfare in D minor in winds, brass, and percussion. It is in triple meter, 3/4 time, and it is remarkably dissonant. Richard Wagner, years later, called it a Schreckensfanfare, horror fanfare, and the term has stuck. That's what we'll call it too. Let's listen to the Schreckensfanfare. It is a chord that dissonantly combines B-flat major and D minor, two of the three major key areas of the symphony that are to be superseded by D major in the fourth movement, the finale of the symphony. At this point, let me digress into the tonal structure of the ninth. There is more detail on this in part 1 of my podcast. Professor Robert Greenberg refers to the three major key areas of the ninth as the triumvirate of keys. D minor, prominent in the first movement, is the key of despair. B-flat major, prominent in the third, slow movement, is the key of heroic struggle. D major, which is hinted at in earlier movements but never fully realized, is the key of triumph. The ninth is a victory symphony moving from D minor to D major. Since one of the most important expressive purposes of the overture is to link the new choral material to the prior instrumental music, opening the movement with a recall of the two key areas to be left behind is apropos. The way Beethoven did it, however, is a bit startling. Music critic Michael Steinberg called the Schreckensfanfare, quote, the most horrendous noise Beethoven could devise, unquote. In the music that follows the Schreckensfanfare, we hear an instrumental recitative in low strings, in the cellos and basses. This is the voice of a male hero who will later appear as the solo baritone. The Schreckensfanfare is then repeated in another dramatic, dissonant passage. Low strings respond with another recitative. The music modulates to B-flat major and calms down. The musicologist Kinderman says the impact of this shocking passage is to destroy the peaceful contemplation of the adagio, precipitating a crisis. Let's hear this. Schreckensfanfare. Recitative in low strings. Schreckensfanfare. Recitative. Music calms down. Now, Beethoven recalls the first three movements and rejects each. An Ode to Joy preview then appears and is enthusiastically accepted. It all ends with a firm D major closed cadence, the first in the symphony so far. A closed cadence is a musical punctuation mark that corresponds to a period in written prose. We will listen to this as a continuous sequence, but first let me give you a bit more detail on what you're about to hear. The quiet introduction of the first movement briefly reappears. It is static with a pedal harmony. The hero, in the voice of the low strings, responds with an angry recitative, according to Steinberg. The music fades out, and there's a pause. The fugato theme of the second movement, scherzo, appears in A minor. Remember that in its original version, it was in D minor. The low strings reject it with a brief and more subdued passage. Another pause. Theme A of the slow movement now appears in B-flat major. This is a longer, more leisurely passage. Low strings respond brief and scornful, according to Steinberg. This time, there is no pause. The music segues towards the Ode to Joy preview. Motive of Ode to Joy melody briefly appears, repeated twice in D major. This is cut off by the low strings in a longer passage with loud orchestral chords in emphasis. This new theme is being enthusiastically accepted. The music ends in a D major closed cadence. So, we will now hear the end of Overture Part 1, earlier movements recalled and rejected, Ode to Joy previewed and enthusiastically accepted. First movement introduction. Angry recitative. Pause. Fugato theme of second movement. Recitative. Pause. Slow movement, theme A. Brief recitative. Ode to Joy preview. Ode to Joy enthusiastically accepted. D major closed cadence. It's all quite operatic. In a manuscript from 1823, Beethoven explained the rejection of the earlier themes. The first, because it reminds us of despair. The second is not better, but only somewhat more cheerful. And the third, because it is too tender. Now we move on to the second part of the overture. Part 2 of the overture gives us a full instrumental presentation of the Ode to Joy in 4 variations. The section is entirely in D major, the key of triumph, and the key with which the Victory Symphony will end. Beethoven's variation procedure is interesting in its simplicity and yet high dramatic impact. Beethoven achieves a rousing effect in his statements of the Ode to Joy by keeping the melody unchanged and expanding its texture and dynamics. Texture refers to the number of lines of music being played, i.e., the number of instrument groups playing simultaneously. Dynamics refers to the volume of the music. We will hear these 4 variations and a codetta that extends the last and most rousing variation all in one soundbite. But before that, let me preview what you'll hear. The first statement of the Ode to Joy is a simple melody unaccompanied in cellos and basses, the same low strings that have been stating the earlier recitatives. Note the melody has the following phrase structure: A, B, A prime, B, A prime. Pay attention to these phrases. When the vocal song version of the ode appears, the melody will be split into two parts. First, A, B, A prime, then the B, A prime. In the second statement of the ode, the melody is now in cellos and violas, giving it a higher string sound. Bassoon provides a counter melody and accompaniment, thickening the texture of the music by a bit. The third statement is in violins. The string sound is in yet higher register. The texture thickens to a four-part harmony. Volume rises in the last B-A prime phrase pair in preparation for the next statement. The fourth and final statement of the Ode to Joy is loud and glorious, joyful and celebratory. It is in tutti, the entire orchestra, trumpets blazing the tune, and it is accented with prominent timpani beats. In the codetta that follows, the momentum of the music continues, with full orchestra extending the melody on a motive derived from the theme to an open cadence and a pause. This codetta is important. It will provide an instrumental interlude between the various vocal versions of the ode in the acts to come. The open cadence at the end is the musical equivalent of a comma. Let's now hear the entire part 2 of the overture, the 4 versions of the Ode to Joy, and the codetta. First version, phrase A. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Second version. Third version. Fourth and glorious version. Codetta. The increasing complexity of texture with the progressive assembly of additional instruments is a metaphor for a growing population of people joining in the triumph of the message. Note that this is the end of the overture. The music now enters the 4 vocal acts of the cantata. In the first 2 acts, we will hear the Ode to Joy as a song sung by the chorus and soloists. The 4 instrumental versions of the ode you just heard will each have their corresponding vocal versions, with one extra surprise passage inserted between the 3rd and 4th versions, as you'll hear soon. Cantata Act 1. In this section, we begin hearing a human voice. Beethoven used Friedrich von Schiller's poem An die Freude, Ode to Joy, for the lyrics of his vocals. As I explained in part 1 of this podcast, the poem, originally published in 1785, wasn't particularly auspicious. Schiller himself didn't think much of it. Some critics have called it a glorified drinking song. Yet Beethoven was enamored by it as early as 1793, expressing a desire to set the poem to music. An die Freude was republished as a shorter version of the original in 1803, and it is this one that Beethoven used for his 9th. He selected 36 out of 96 lines and created what musicologist Kinderman calls a series of powerful and direct images with universal social connotations. The act begins with a quiet, slow interlude in flutes and oboes. It is marked poco ritente in the score by Beethoven, indicating a sudden and temporary decrease in the tempo to hold back for dramatic effect. The interlude is derived from the Ode to Joy. It is reminiscent of the ode-like passages of the earlier movements that I outlined in part 1 of this podcast. Kinderman calls it one of those gripping narrative moments that looks backwards and forwards at the same moment. An orchestral tutti based on this music follows, picking up energy and momentum. After the glory of the Ode to Joy, the expectation is more of the same. But now, a surprise. The Schreckens fanfare reappears in D minor, loud and dissonant. It is followed by an open cadence and a pause. This is a cue for the human voice, the baritone, to enter. The solo baritone pleads in an a cappella recitative. A cappella means no instrumental accompaniment. O Freunde, nicht diese Töne. O friends, not this tone. A quiet string interlude follows. By the way, I would like to apologize for my German, for those of you who are German speakers. If I mispronounce things, my apologies. The baritone continues. Sondern lasst uns angenehmer anstimmen. Rather, let us sing more pleasantly. Loud orchestral chords follow in emphasis. The baritone sings his last line, und freudenvollere, and more joyfully. Note that there will be a large melisma on freuden, joyful, and a repetition of this word. A melisma is a vowel sung through different pitches. Beethoven is clearly emphasizing freuden, joy. A single loud orchestral chord and a pause follow. Please note that these so far are Beethoven's own words. They are not from Schiller's poem An die Freude. Let's now hear this dramatic transition from instrumental to vocal that opens Act 1 of the cantata. We will hear an interlude, the orchestral tutti, Schreckens fanfare, and the baritone's introductory lines. Interlude. Orchestral tutti. Schreckens fanfare. O friends, not this tone. Rather, let us sing more pleasantly. Und freudenvollere, more joyfully. Melismas und Freuden. We will now begin hearing the various vocal versions of the Ode to Joy as a song. This is preceded by a dramatic prelude. The baritone shouts, Freude, joy. It is dramatically echoed by the choral basses, Freude. This double shout of Freude is repeated. Winds accompany, quietly foreshadowing the Ode to Joy. The first version of the Ode to Joy is simple and thinly textured, corresponding to its counterpart in the overture. The solo baritone sings the A, B, A prime phrases of the Ode to Joy with wind and pizzicato low string accompaniment. He recites 2 verses of the Schiller poem. Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. O joy, thou lovely spark of God, daughter of Elysium. Wir betreten, feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. We enter drunk with fire, immortal goddess, thy holy shrine. Next verse. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt, thy magic does again unite what custom has torn apart. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weit. All men shall be brothers where thy gentle wind is spread. The chorus, without sopranos, loudly and triumphantly repeat the Deine Zauber binden wieder verse as the last 2 B A prime phrases of the Ode to Joy. The orchestral codetta follows. Let's now hear the beginning of the vocal Ode to Joy, the shouts of Freude, and the first vocal version of the ode. Note that the chorus stated Alle Menschen werden Brüder, all men shall be brothers, loudly. This will be further emphasized in the coda. It is one of the central messages of the symphony. At this point, I will digress to discuss the word Elysium and its important role in the overall narrative of the Ninth. In part 1 of this podcast, I stated the musicologist Kinderman's interpretation of the meaning of the Ninth. The 9th Symphony has become an unsurpassable model of affirmative culture, embodying as it does a mythic narrative that depicts inescapable problems of modern life and envisages a potential solution. In the first 3 movements of the Ninth, we encountered the inescapable problems of modern life, and with the relatively peaceful 3rd movement, the Sloman, we came to terms with them. Here, in the 4th movement, Beethoven is presenting us with his vision of a utopian afterlife, the mythic narrative anchored on Elysium. Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, is an ancient Greek conception of the afterlife, something akin to the Christian paradise, but reserved only for mortals related to the gods and other heroes, and for those chosen by the gods, the righteous, heroic humans. This concept has captured the post-Renaissance imagination, Elysium appearing in all sorts of places, from literature, for instance Dante's Divine Comedy, to modern movies, from Schiller and Beethoven's references in the Ode to Joy to countless geographic names, the most famous being the Champs-Élysées, the Grand Boulevard in Paris. The word means Elysian Fields. Beethoven's overall narrative, a victory symphony from D minor, the key of despair, to D major, the key of triumph, ends in Elysium. In the trio section of the second movement, the scherzo, Beethoven presented pastoral music akin to his Symphony No. 6. As I indicated in part 1 of this podcast, some scholars view this trio as a representation of Arcadia, another mythical Greek concept. Arcadia is the idyllic version of unspoiled wilderness in Greek mythology, inhabited by noble savages. The musicologist Maynard Solomon, who also, by the way, wrote a definitive biography of Beethoven that I would recommend for those interested, points out an overall narrative arc in the ninth from Arcadia to Elysium. As he puts it, a spiral journey from Arcadia to Elysium, that of paradise lost and regained. A final point. Beethoven, an unhappy mortal suffering with the burden of deafness, put out a monumental work in which he contemplated a paradise for heroic mortals as the mythical solutions to the problems of modern life 3 years before his own death. As universal as the ninth has become for the world, it was, in my opinion, still intensely personal for Beethoven. Back to the music. The vocal treatment of the second version of the Ode to Joy is thicker in texture, corresponding to its instrumental counterpart in the overture. The four soloists, soprano, alto, baritone, and tenor, sing two more verses of Schiller's poem to the A-B, A' phrases of the Ode to Joy in polyphony. Here are the words. Wem der große Wurf gelungen, eines Freundes Freund zu sein, he who has known the great good fortune of being bosom friend to friend, wer eines holdes Weib errungen, mische seinen Jubel ein, he who has won a loving wife, let him join the rejoicing. Ja, wer auch nur eine Seele sein nennt auf dem Erden tut, yea, all who can call one soul theirs, join in our song of praise. Und wer's nie gekonnt, der Stäble, weinen sich aus diesem Band. And any who cannot must steal away, weeping from our band. The chorus repeats the last verse from Ja, wer auch onwards, with the second B-A' phrases of the Ode to Joy. Orchestral codetta follows. Here's the second version of the Ode to Joy. Note that the line Wer eines holdes Weib errungen He who has won a loving wife carries a special personal significance for Beethoven, who never had a loving wife. He was a lonely bachelor all his life, his house in disarray, his personal appearance slovenly. This version of the ode reflects the composer's own personal yearnings. Act 1 ends with a third version of the Ode to Joy. Solo quartet sings verses of Schiller's poem in ornamental variation with the A, B, A prime phrases of the Ode to Joy. This version is highly embellished. Note that the sopranos go up to a high B, probably the most difficult passage ever written for voices, says Sir Donald Tovey. The words are as follows. Freude trinken alle Wesen an den Brüsten der Natur. All creatures drink of joy at nature's breast. Alle Guten, all Bosen, folgen ihrer Rosenspur. Good and evil alike taste of her rosy gift. Küsse gab sie uns und Reben, einen Freund gepfrüht im Tod. Kisses she gave us, and the vine, a proven friend until death. Wollust ward dem Würm gegeben, und der Cherub steht vor God. Even a worm can feel contentment, and the cherub stands before God. The chorus repeats the last two verses from Küsse gab sie uns onwards with the second B, A prime phrases of the Ode to Joy. This is the loudest and most dramatic choral section yet. The familiar codetta does not follow. Instead, the chorus continues on and climaxes on repeats of forgot, before God. The harmony shifts to B-flat major in the last, loudest, and longest sustained forgot. Then a huge open cadence, a comma, and a pause. Act 1 is over. Here's a third vocal version of the ode, highly embellished, with the forgot ending. The forgot ending. Harmony shifts to B flat. A pretty dramatic ending to Act 1, wouldn't you say? Act 2. Earlier, I told you that the four instrumental versions of the Ode to Joy we heard in the overture each had their vocal counterparts in the acts of the cantata. Yet so far, we've only heard three vocal versions. The most dramatic, exultant fourth instrumental Ode to Joy has not had its counterpart. Be patient, it's coming. But first, Beethoven presents us with a digression in the beginning of Act 2 that has come to be called the Turkish March version of the Ode to Joy. Beethoven marks the score alla marcia, with march rhythm. The act has four subsections that alternate between instrumental and vocal. The first subsection is instrumental, presenting the Turkish March version of the Ode to Joy. Out of the silence, a distant bassoon begins a march with a bass drum beating the rhythm. The Ode to Joy appears as a march in winds with cymbals and triangles in the key of B-flat major. The melody gradually gets louder, giving the impression of a distant army marching closer. Here's the Turkish March instrumental version. Some comments. We are in the key of B-flat major, the key of heroic struggle, now in a heroic march. The Turkish march variation is the same melody as the original Ode to Joy, but with each note doubled. The doubled pairs have the same short, long rhythmic signature as the intro of the first movement at the very beginning of the symphony. So here we go, instead of ta-ra, 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 the original Ode to Joy, we get ta-ra, 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 ta-ra. And again, this ta-ra, ta-ra rhythm is the same as ta-ra, 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 the beginning of the first movement. The simplicity of the variation is just the genius of it is admirable. Next point. The music has nothing to do with authentic Turkish music. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was at war with the Turks for nearly 400 years. The interaction resulted in cultural exchanges and mutual impressions. In Beethoven's time, any music that sounded vaguely exotic, especially with cymbals or other percussion, was labeled Turkish. Finally, an interesting piece of trivia. This is the only time Beethoven used the bass drum in any of his symphonies. You can use that in a cocktail party. In the second subsection of Act 2, we are treated to a vocal equivalent of the instrumental Turkish march we just heard. The solo tenor sings the A, B, A prime phrases of the next stanza in broken phrases using the melody of the march variation. The words are Froh wie seine Sonnen fliegen, durch des Himmels Prachtgenplan, happily like the heavenly bodies through the glorious plain of heaven. Laufet Brüder eure Bahn, brothers run your course, freudig wie ein Heid zum Siegen, joyful as hero to victory. Male chorus repeats the last B, A prime phrases of the Laufet Brüder eure Bahn onwards. Here's the vocal version of the Turkish march. So it is his military note that Beethoven sounds when Schiller compares heroes with the stars in their courses, says Sir Donald Tovey. The third subsection is a fugue. It is instrumental with no vocal parts. It is a massive four-part fugue in B-flat major with its subject based on the march variation of the Ode to Joy. It begins in violins, progresses in imitative entry toward the lower strings. The fugue is energetic and has forward-driving momentum. It ends with massive, short, long rhythm concluding chords, the same rhythm as those of the introduction of Movement 1. Transitional anticipatory music follows, quiet passage of horn fanfares, also with the same ta-da rhythm, alternating with Ode to Joy motive in winds. Here's the Turkish march fugue. Note that this massive fugue was foreshadowed by a fugue in the first movement development section that I played in part 1 of this podcast. The current fugue you just heard will have its own choral counterpart towards the end of Act 3. You can't help but admire Beethoven's tight Germanic compositional constructs across the movement and across the entire symphony. And now for the dramatic ending of Act 2. What could this anticipatory music be expecting? It is a moment of the 9th that'll give you goosebumps in live performance. Yes, a massive, glorious, fortissimo vocal counterpart to the exuberant fourth version of the ode in the overture, the one we've been waiting for. Note that the lyrics are the same as that of the first vocal ode to joy from Act 1. Also note that the orchestral extension, the codetta, began as in the earlier versions, but was soon abruptly cut off with a cadence and a pause. The cantata will now move on to Act 3. Act 3. This is a section of thanksgiving and heavenly devotion. It features music that sounds ecclesiastic. Hymn of Brotherhood. It begins with a hymn of brotherhood. Tenors and basses of the male chorus make a fortissimo unison proclamation in G major. The words are, Seid umschlungen Millionen, be embraced ye millions, diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt, this kiss is for all the world. Loud trombone accompaniment in unison with the chorus gives the music a ceremonial air. This is the first entry of the trombone since the scherzo. Note that the simplicity of this new melody and its lack of texture makes it sound like a plain chant. Full chorus and orchestra repeat the verse, but now in a thickly textured version with the harmonies filled in. The same procedure is repeated for the next verse, still plain chant-like. Brüder, überm Sternzelt, brothers above the starry heavens, muss ein lieber Vater wohnen, a loving father must surely dwell. Male tenors and basses proclaim this with trombone fanfares in accompaniment. Chorus and orchestra repeat the verse in a polyphonic version, fortissimo in F major. Here's the hymn of brotherhood. Be embraced, ye millions. This kiss is for all the world. brothers, above the starry heavens, a loving Father must surely dwell. Hymn to God. The next section is a hymn to God. It starts with a quiet instrumental passage with a church organ-like sound in the key of G minor. The chorus sings two versions in a slow, devotional rhythm. Ihr stürzt nieder Millionen, do you fall in worship, ye millions? Ahnest du den Schöpfer Welt? Do you know your Creator, world? Suchen überm Sternenzelt, seek him above the starry heavens. Über Sternen musst wohnen, above the stars he surely dwells. The music rises on the word Welt, world, and again on Zelt, heavens. The last line, Über Sternen muss wohnen, above the stars he surely dwells, is proclaimed fortissimo. A pause follows. Now, very quiet, shimmering, heavenly music appears, followed by a pause. Über Sternen muss wohnen, above the stars he surely dwells, is repeated quietly with a throbbing, ethereal accompaniment. Michael Steinberg calls it the most mysterious, anti-gravitational, unearthly music in the symphony. Here's the hymn to God. Quiet instrumental passage. Do you fall in worship, ye millions? Do you know your Creator, world? Seek him above the starry heavens. Above the stars he surely dwells. Shimmering heavenly music. Above the stars he surely dwells. Ethereal version. This section has featured what Donald Tovey considers the central thought of the 9th Symphony, the divine glory and the awestruck prostration of mankind. Double Fugue and Aftermath. The last section of Act 3 is a massive choral fugue. The chorus breaks into a torrential double fugue of the two main themes, says Tovey, the Ode to Joy and Hymn of Brotherhood. You will hear these two themes together, musical lines of equal importance, in a colossal polyphonic passage. The music will be back in the key of D major, the key of triumph. The fugue is slow and sustained. Listen for the sopranos who, towards the end, hold a high A for 13 measures on the word Welt, world. Tovey calls it the standard example of Beethoven's extreme demand on the voices. The music then abruptly drops to pianissimo, an abrupt plunge into the deepest prostration, according to Tovey. The chorus quietly repeats the two prior verses with a pulsating accompaniment. Ihr stürzt nieder Millionen, Honest du den Schöpferwelt. Do you fall in worship, ye millions? Do you know your creator world? Suchen überm Sternenzelt, seek him above the starry heavens. Suchen überm Sternenzelt, seek him above the starry heavens. The music rises on the last line. The next verse is sung as a quiet, devotional hymn. Brüder, Brüder, überm Sternenzelt. Brothers, brothers, above the starry heavens. Muss ein lieber Vater wohnen. A loving father must surely dwell. Ein lieben Vater wohnen. A loving father must surely dwell. This accompaniment is shimmering heavenly music again. The act ends with a pause. Let's hear the double fugue and its aftermath. Sopranos hold high A on belt. Abrupt plunge into the deepest prostration. Brothers, brothers, above the starry heavens, a loving father must surely dwell. As you might have gathered by now, the message of the cantata has two elements, secular and religious. Acts 1 and 2 deal with the secular, Act 3 deals with the religious. The musicologist Lockwood points out that the two worlds of feeling are united by combining the two disparate themes in a double fugue that brings together both their melodies and their texts. This huge double fugue is the apex and culmination of the three monumental fugues Beethoven created for the ninth. Act 4, Coda. The coda does not present any new verses of the poem. It revisits those that Beethoven considers worthy of emphasis. The beginning of the coda is remarkable for its childlike, joyful simplicity, refreshing after all the heavy-duty music that preceded it, especially that fugue. Tovey says nothing like it had been sounded in music since Mozart's Magic Flute. Beethoven regards this childlike note as the very consummation of joy. It is a rising melody in strings in the key of D major. The solo quartet sings the first verse of the poem with a new, fast, cheerful variation of the Ode to Joy in imitative polyphony. That means that the musical lines are of equal importance, polyphony, and staggered out of phase from each other, imitative. The passage rises in volume from piano to forte. Freude, Tochter aus Elysium, O joy, daughter of Elysium, deine Zauber binden wieder, thy magic does again unite, was die Mode streng geteilt, what custom has torn apart. The full chorus follows with the second verse, Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt, thy magic does again unite what custom has torn apart. Then the music rises to a climax. Music then slows and drops back to piano, quiet, on the next verse, sung by full chorus. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, all men shall be brothers, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt, where thy gentle wing is spread. After a brief wind and horn interlude, the tempo picks up and gets faster. The full chorus sings the Deine Zauber, thy magic verse, in a fast crescendo and follows with Alle Menschen from the all men shall be brothers verse, fast and fortissimo in a polyphonic passage. The rest of the verse, all men shall be brothers where thy gentle wing is spread, is sung quietly in a hymn-like passage, the texture simplified. Note that there will be multiple melismas. Again, a melisma, a vowel sung on different pitches. On wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt, thy gentle wing is spread. The music will have a plain chant-like quality and sound like flapping winds. This is called tone painting. The music pauses before the grand finale. Here's the coda, first half. Childlike, joyful music. O joy, daughter of Elysium. Thy magic does again unite what custom is torn apart. Climax. All men shall be brothers. Where thy gentle wing is spread. Horn interlude. Crescendo on Deine Zauber. All men shall be brothers. Tone painting on thy gentle wing is spread. Note that the central message of this part of the coda is all men shall be brothers. Alle Menschen werden Brüder dominates this part of the coda. It is a universal message that we too believe here in the 21st century, nearly 200 years after the premiere of the 9th. In fact, all men shall be brothers is a lot more familiar to us than Elysium, the other central message of the movement, which will dominate the rest of the coda. This is one of the many reasons why the 9th remains extremely relevant today as it was at the time of its premiere. The coda continues to its finale, beginning with quiet, descending two-step motives that pick up speed. A fast crescendo inaugurates a celebratory instrumental introduction of the full chorus. It includes multiple percussion instruments. The chorus erupts with a fast fortissimo passage, as Tovey puts it. The whole mass of singers and voices is ablaze with the wildest outburst of joy. They sing the following verses. Seid umschlungen Millionen, be embraced ye millions. Diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt, this kiss is for all the world. Brüder überm Sternenzelt, brothers above the starry heavens, muss ein lieben Vater wohnen, a loving father must surely dwell. Seid umschlungen diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt, be embraced, this kiss is for all the world. And then, Freude schöner Götterfunken, O joy, thou lovely spark of God. The momentum breaks with Tochter aus Elysium, daughter of Elysium, sung in unison, slower and quieter, emphasizing the line. Freude schöner Götterfunken, Götterfunken, O joy, thou lovely spark of God, is sung aloud in unison with a slower tempo and with cymbal clashes at the end of each word. Marked prestissimo by Beethoven, the movement concludes triumphantly in orchestra with a fast version of the Ode to Joy based on the variation that began Act 4. Here's the glorious finale of the coda and of Symphony Number 9. After the great applause and the standing ovation comes to an end, let's say some final comments. Let me begin with a quote from Professor Robert Greenberg that I stated at the very beginning of this talk in part 1 of the podcast. Professor Greenberg said, Beethoven's 9th, without argument, is the single most influential piece of European music written in the 19th century and the most influential symphony ever composed. Michael Steinberg says, by carrying to new heights the concept of the Victory Symphony as worked out in the Eroica and the Fifth, Beethoven's Ninth redefines the nature of symphonic ambition. Kinderman. The choral finale is the most celebrated single example in Beethoven of a composite form that successfully blends the possibilities of different genres. It is an important progenitor of later efforts along these lines. Steinberg again. The Ode to Joy is one of the world's great songs. It demonstrates a quest for simplicity and immediacy in the late Beethoven. His great gamble to invent the quintessentially popular tune succeeds miraculously. I love this next quote from Professor Greenberg, who says, "The Ninth remains the most analyzed, polemicized, philosophized, bastardized, scrutinized, and otherwise written about and discussed piece of music in our Western repertoire." Lockwood. By using Schiller's ode to directly address humanity at large, Beethoven conveyed the struggle of both the individual and of the millions who work their way through experience from tragedy to idealism, and to preserve the image of human brotherhood as a defense against darkness. And finally, the simplest and yet most powerful quote about the Ninth from a composer who picked up where Beethoven left, Gustav Mahler. Symphony as the world. This concludes my two-part description of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. I thank you for your attention, and I applaud those who stuck with both of these long and detailed podcasts. Now I recommend that you go to a recording of the symphony and get the message from the master, Beethoven himself. Farewell.